Yeah, welcome to the World Energy Council. Welcome to our webinar, European Energy Market in the Light of Current Geopolitical Crisis. In fact, a webinar that we want to do together with Aurora Energy Research as a sort of preview of our annual publication, Energie für Deutschland, Energy for Germany, and its European chapter in there. And in fact, I'm very glad to have two excellent speakers that will guide us into the webinar. Before we will have the chance to have an exchange here on our webinar with you, with all the questions that might arise. As 1 year, or more than 1 year, after the war of aggression started and the energy crisis started, the energy landscape has changed dramatically. When it comes to topics like resilience, when it comes to topics like the competitiveness of European energy prices. And that's why it's a good point in time to state where do we stand also before the next winter. We just recovered from the last winter gas-wise, electricity price-wise, and now it's good to also look forward. How are we prepared for future events of scarcity and price crises? With no further ado, I'd like to introduce then Daniel Böhmer from Aurora Energy Research, who will be with us introducing the main topic. Daniel is an energy researcher for several years there before Dr. Georg Zachmann from Bruegel will comment on. Last remark before we go into the session. This session will be recorded, so if you stay in this session, you will be counted as if you've agreed to this that we will record and put the session on our website afterwards. So, Daniel, with this, I'd like to hand it over to you. I'm very curious, what's your view on the state of European energy policy so far?
Great, thanks a lot. I'm going to share my screen and I hope you can all see it. Maybe, yeah, 2 sentences of introduction. As it was already mentioned, I work for Aurora Energy Research. We are a global energy market and analytics and modeling company. And we mainly help our clients with long-term energy market forecasts. Although obviously today we rather look at past developments and also the short-term implications for next winter. So yeah, without further ado, I would like to share with you the outlook of my presentation today. So first, I want to take a look back on last year, mainly on gas markets and power markets, and then secondly, take a look at developments that we can expect for this year, and especially with regards to gas supply the next winter. So as you all know, the main theme really last year on the European energy markets was the reduction in Russian gas flows to Europe. Here on this chart, we can see the monthly average of daily Russian gas deliveries to Europe from December 2019 to December 2022. And well, broken down by the delivery routes. And what we can see is that already over the course of 2021, we saw a reduction of flows, but then the sharp drop happened between June last year and August last year, when Russia first reduced the flows via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, before they came to a complete halt by the end of August. And then before the pipeline was destroyed in an act of sabotage later. So if we compare supplies in December 2021 to December 2022, they decreased by almost 80%. So how the European countries then react to this? Broadly speaking, we can say in 2 ways. Firstly, they diverted their supply flows or their import flows away from Russian gas. And secondly, they reduced their demand. If we take a look at the chart on the left-hand side first, which shows supply, we can see two main things if you compare again December 21 to December 22. First, Russian flows really collapsed. They made up a share of 25% still in December 21, and that came down to only 6% at the end of last year. And the other main trend that we see is the increase in LNG, here colored in green, which almost doubled in terms of the share in gas supply. Now, in terms of demand, when you look at the right-hand side, here we see the demand reduction in percentage terms for the EU, selected EU member states, and the UK. We see overall demand in the EU went down by 13%, although we saw quite some divergence or differences between the member states. And generally speaking, we can say that those member states that were most dependent on Russian gas then reduced their gas demand the most. For instance, in Finland, gas demand went down by almost 50%. On the other hand, there were also some countries or some EU member states where gas demand didn't decrease as much. And an interesting case here are Spain and Portugal, because here the relatively modest reduction was related to a government intervention into the price for gas used in the power sector. And I will touch upon that later when we take a look at the developments on the power sector. Now, what did these the sudden decrease in Russian supply and this shift to LNG mean for gas prices? Now, here I show the prices for natural gas on various hubs, gas trading hubs in Europe. And before we dive into the developments over the course of last year, the first thing to note is that already at the beginning of the year, we started with record high gas prices. So if you take a look at the dashed line, the black dashed line, this shows the average of the European benchmark TTF gas price in 2021, which was at around 46 euro per megawatt hour. And then the dotted line, even below, shows the average price in 2020, which was below 10 euro per megawatt hour. So those are the price levels that we came from. And then over the course of 2022, however, we then again saw an even higher increase of gas prices, which was closely related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we saw the first spike in March 2022 when the invasion started, and then sort of the second surge between June and August, and that was this period that I mentioned earlier when Russia reduced its pipeline flows via Nord Stream 1, and then this aggressive EU state-backed gas procurement started. The prices then came down again towards the end of the year because governments were quite successful with the efforts to procure LNG, and also storage levels were filled above seasonal averages by October, so by the start of the winter. Another aspect I want to highlight on this chart is the divergence between gas prices on these hubs, which is quite unusual when looked at it historically. And the reason here is this sudden shift to LNG, where in some countries there were bottlenecks because there was just not enough regasification capacity to absorb that LNG. And that was particularly the case in Germany and the Netherlands, for instance, which is why we see the detach, for instance, from the UK, Spanish, and French prices, hub prices, to the German and TTF prices. So that was the sort of quick overview of what happened on gas markets last year. So let's now take a look at the developments on the EU power sector. And I would like to start where I left off with the gas markets, namely the prices, given the strong relation between gas prices and power prices. So here on this slide, on the upper half, I show the average monthly wholesale power prices for selected countries, for selected European countries. And then below that, again, the monthly average of the day-ahead TTF gas price. Now, similar to the situation on gas markets, already at the beginning of the year, beginning of last year, prices were on record levels. So here, the red dashed line at the bottom shows the average of day-ahead wholesale prices in Germany in the 5 years preceding the COVID pandemic, so from 2015 to 2019. We can then see that over the year, the development of power prices followed the development of gas prices quite well, at least in most countries. And this is because of the merit order principle, which means that whenever a gas-fired power plant is the marginal producing plant, these very high gas prices translated directly into wholesale power prices. However, we also see, similar to the situation on gas markets, quite some divergence between wholesale power prices between the member states. For instance, if you look at the blue line and the green line, which represent prices for Poland and Sweden, we can see that these were significantly lower than in other countries. And that is the reason here is that these countries are just not as reliant or not reliant at all on gas-fired power generation for their electricity supply. Now, another case is Spain, as I already mentioned. So if you look at the black line, we see that detach from other prices around June. And that's when the Spanish and Portuguese governments decided to implement that cap on the price of gas used in the power sector, which then led to to a decrease of prices. Now, let's divert away from prices and let's take a look at how the electricity supply mix looked like last year. So here on the left-hand side, I show the electricity supply mix for last year, and then to put it in perspective, also for 2010. Now, if you look at last year first, you can see that the single largest contributor for power in the EU was nuclear energy, followed by gas and coal. However, for the first time, and that's something worth mentioning, I think, the generation of solar and wind combined was higher than the generation of gas-fired generation in the EU. Now, comparing it to 2010, I think we can see it shows the rapid transition that our power sector is undergoing quite nicely. For instance, if you look at solar, the share of solar generation in the total power mix increased 9-fold, wind increased 3-fold, and at the same time, all of the fossil-based power generation sources and also nuclear were on decline. And this is also shown when we look at the trends that are shown on the right-hand side. So these are the power generation by type of energy source, so fossil, renewables, and nuclear. So we can clearly see that increase of renewables and the decrease of fossil. However, when we look at just the last 2 years, from 2021 to 2022, we can see that fossil generation just surpassed renewables again. And I will explain the reasons for that on the next slide. So on this slide, I compare the total generation in the year 2021 with a generation in 2022. And if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, we can clearly see these big drops in both nuclear generation and hydropower generation. Now, for nuclear, the reasons were, firstly, a combination of maintenance, unplanned outages, and lack of cooling water in France, combined with the decommissioning of 3 nuclear reactors in Germany at the end of 2021, in line with the nuclear exit policy. Hydro generation was the lowest in 20 years due to a drought that impacted large parts of Europe in the first half of 2022, and especially the southern part of Europe. Now, this supply gap compared to the previous year was partly made up by an impressive increase in solar and wind generation. However, part of it also had to be filled by an increase in coal generation, which then explains this increase in the relative share of fossil generation compared to the previous year. Overall, demand was also lower by 79 terawatt hours compared to the previous year. Now, on the right-hand side, I show this development, this comparison to 2021 on a monthly basis, and also add demand. And some of the main takeaways here really are that nuclear was below previous year production throughout the year, and it actually got worse throughout the year. The the undersupply of hydro-based generation was mainly in the first half of the year. And on the flip side, also the increase in coal generation was mainly between January and August of last year. What's also worth noting is that the drop in demand towards the last 4 months of the year, and those are firstly related to these sharp increases in prices that we can see. So there's some price reaction and demand destruction, but also due to a very low winter that we had last year until the first 2 months of this year. Finally, to close the section on the power sector, when we look at emissions, it is unsurprising that if the share of fossil generation increases, that also the emissions increase. So we saw the second increase of power sector emissions since 2020. However, the emissions were still below pre-pandemic levels, so still below 2019 levels. So having talked and having introduced a bit the developments that happened last year, let's now take a look at what we can expect for this year and especially next winter. So I first want to introduce you to two gas supply scenarios that my colleagues in the commodity team of Aurora Energy Research worked on. And caution, there's a lot going on in the slide, but don't worry, I will guide you through it step by step. So what we see on the slide here from the left-hand side up to the orange bar is how we think that supply might stack up in the upcoming winter. And then on the right-hand side, so with the red bars, here we show some demand estimates that we compare supply against. So if we start at the very left, the assumption is that we will at least have the same supply that Europe secured last winter. We will have again in the period between October 2023 and March 2024. And this is particularly important with regards to Russian imports, because here the assumption is that the import flows that remained until now, that these remain open also in the next winter. And then on top of that supply that we had last year, we assume that there will be some additional supply. And the biggest chunk here is what is colored here in rows is LNG imports, because as you all might know, new LNG terminals were built. So as soon as these are operational and these are fully maxed out, you can assume that LNG supply will be higher than in the last winter. Now, what's also worth noting is if we look at the yellow bar, the yellow section, is that we assume that storage will again be above average at the beginning of the winter, so that in October this year, storage will be filled to 90%, and it will then be depleted down to 18% by the end of the winter, which matches the 10-year low. So if we add all this together, so then we arrive at 320 billion cubic meters of gas supply for the next winter. So how does this compare to demand? So if we look at the 5-year average demand, which is 314 billion cubic meters, then the supply would be sufficient to meet that demand. However, if we look at the very or particularly cold winter, then demand could not be, well, then supply could not be sufficient to meet that demand. And what does this mean? This would mean that we would again see cuts to consumptions similar to last winter, when we saw a demand destruction, particularly in industry sectors and also in household sectors. Now, this is sort of the more realistic scenario that we can look at. What we also worked on let's say a worst case scenario. Now the idea of this scenario is very simple. There's just some notable changes. So if we start from the left hand side again, here we assume that Russian imports will halt completely, so we won't have that remaining Russian flows anymore. we also assume that we will not get additional LNG supply in the next winter, for instance, because competition from Asia, from China increases, so that these LNG flows are directed elsewhere. And we also assume that storage will only be filled to 80% until October this year. However, there is some additional supply because we do assume that in such a crisis scenario with a lower supply, storage would be depleted completely. So there is this additional 19 BCM of storage supply. Still, if we look at the orange bar, the total supply would then be at 276 BCM, which is below the 5-year average demand in Europe over these months. And of course, if worst comes worst, and we have a low supply and a very cold winter, then this gap could amount to up to 90 BCM in the next winter, which would really mean that we would need to see significant cuts in demand. Obviously, this would then be driven by very high gas prices again. Now, the last slide I want to discuss with you is sort of an outlook on the power sector and taking a look at what happened so far this year. So here on the left-hand side, I compare the EU power generation mix in the first 4 months of this year to the first 4 months of the previous year. And what we see is that overall supply is lower, and that's because of that mild winter also, so demand was lower. And particularly fossil generation was lower by 16%, so gas and coal-fired power generation. On the flip side, wind and solar generation increased. Now, if we look at those two energy sources that were sort of a source of worry last year, so nuclear and hydro, let's have a look at how these could develop this year. So on the upper chart on the right-hand side, I depict monthly hydro generation in the EU. And the dotted line shows the average between 2019 and 2015 and 2019. The gray line shows the production in 2022. And lastly, the yellow line shows the generation so far this year. So we can see that generation is slightly above previous year levels, but the trend is not going in the right direction. And coming off a very dry winter and also spring, I think it's fair to assume that we will again see a below average hydropower generation this year. And if you turn to nuclear, here I depicted not the sort of the EU generation, but the French case particular, because as you know, France is really the main provider of nuclear-powered electricity in the EU. So what can we see here? So we can see that until April this year, first nuclear power generation in France was below previous year levels. In April, it was then slightly above. And then what you see in the yellow dotted line is a projection that our French research team has worked out based on the announcements of EDF and also of RTE, which is the regulator in France. And based on these estimates of nuclear availability, we can see that nuclear generation in France will be slightly above previous year levels, most likely if we don't see any unforeseen outages again, which we have seen in the past, but also below 2021 levels and below historic levels. So to sum this up, I think it's fair to say that we will again see low hydro and nuclear generation this year, but due to the mild winter weather in the first few months of this year, and due to an increase and a rapid build-out of renewable capacity and therefore an increase in renewable generation, I think to make an optimistic expectation, we can expect power sector emissions to go down compared to the previous year. And with that, I close my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel Böhmer, for this look back analysis and the outlook. it doesn't really calm down everyone, I guess. If you hear the analysis when it comes to gas, you said, well, markets, policy, and to some extent, I think the mild weather of the last winter. We've been lucky made us quite okay in dealing with the gas scarcity last winter. And big question for the next winter is, in fact, what are the critical uncertainties? You mentioned change of behavior, maybe when it comes to saving of gas. What is with the global LNG supply in other regions like China? What is with the Ukrainian or the Russian-Ukrainian gas route and the remaining gas? Is that still stable? And of course, again, what about the weather? Is this going to be a hard winter or a normal one, a milder one? And many of the projections depend on this. And on the electricity side, I think that was very well pointed out. It was a triple crisis. We saw high gas prices. We saw a scarcity of water and a scarcity of nuclear. And although this seems to be like a unique crisis, having all these three together, there are at least some signals that water scarcity and to some extent nuclear availability won't be normal next year as well. So there's still some crises that might be possible, at least when it comes to availability, and when it comes to prices, things might be even more difficult. Now, with this, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Georg Zachmann from Bruegel Institute in Brussels, well-known energy economist, energy analyst, policy analyst, and I'm sure he will add a few more comments and views on what that might do with also policymakers and their responses to the analysis that we've heard. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, many thanks. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I think it's great, and I mean, that we have this database discussion. And last year has shown again how important it is to have objective and useful energy data in a timely way available. And I think you're doing a great job to the community with that. And we should have more of this, because if we look back a bit into what has been missing was that policymakers were not aware of where the gas flows are coming, how much gas was imported by Germany from Russia, and I mean, we were relatively uninformed going into the crisis, and we need to step this up. And the World Energy Council is certainly one of the contributors here. Now, Bruegel is an independent think tank in Brussels, so kind of paid by member states and large companies. And what I would like to do now is to provide you a short, maybe a few comments on the presentation we had before, and then a short outlook on our end, and then a bit of a longer term outlook. So my take on what happened last year kind of echoes a lot what Daniel Böhmer indicated in terms of how we made it. So 50% was essentially, so of the gas we replaced by additional imports, 50% we replaced by reducing our consumption. And the additional challenge last year was that we had to refill our storages because they were depleted in 2021. Now, on the factors that are augmenting the problem or reducing the problem, I agree that nuclear outages were a huge problem. I think the failure of Freeport was also quite substantial as an LNG liquefaction plant. Now we have every year some problems in LNG liquefaction. So maybe last year it was the Freeport year, so it might come again. But having Freeport back might at least, if everything goes well, help us quite a bit. In terms of weather, I'm less sure. I mean, the statistics I have seen were either indicating we had a normal winter or at least a winter that was in line with the declining trend of heating degree days. Because I mean, if you look into the data since 1979 or so, that are available, you see it's a linear trend of reduction of heating degree days. So. I mean, climate change in this instance has potentially helped us and might be in normal times expected to help us the next winter as well. What has really helped us a lot is prices, high prices. I think high prices fending off demand and attracting LNG, and that would be my main policy message, that if we start intervening into prices, we should be really aware that we are walking on a tightrope here. And if we get it wrong, if industry starts to consume more gas, then we can quickly come back into risky territory, and we might not attract the LNG needed. And another element that I find noteworthy and maybe a bit under-discussed is the importance of renewables deployment. We have seen quite a bit of solar deployment last year and also a bit of wind deployment that will help us already this year. And everything that can be done this year and next year will kind of reduce the pressure on our system, because we still see gas being used for power generation. And here we would have a double benefit, probably better than any price breaks or artificially intervening in the market would be to boost our supply situation. Now, next slide. We also tried our winter scenarios. It's not looking as beautiful as Daniel's, but I think you can see that essentially the picture is the same. So if you look into the last scenario, which is a scenario without Russian gas flows, and if you look from the right, when electricity output is low and it is cold, and it is not warm, and we anyway have to reduce demand. So we would have to reduce demand compared to pre-crisis level by 28%, which is a lot. And so in that is our essentially worst case scenario. Now in more normal case scenarios, we still get in the order of 13% demand reduction. So message is the same as Daniel's. We are not yet through. And next slide, please. And also for Germany, there is no space for mistakes being made, and we cannot really start experimenting. One thing that I find interesting is that last year we had in October the storages, or early November the storages were full, and we had no space left for putting additional LNG into storages in Europe, while the Ukrainian storages were not yet filled. And so thinking about a way to maybe using those, I think 30 BCM of Ukrainian storage might kind of give us a bit more buffer for a potentially cold winter. And if the gas is there anyway, why not? And here on the demand reductions we saw last year, I mean, the striking factor is that in the power sector, we used more gas than in normal times. And I mean, that's essentially crazy if you think about us having the biggest gas crisis in our history. And here with renewables and demand reduction on the electricity side, we potentially can help more. Next slide. Now, I'll try to be a bit more provocative now by looking ahead. I think it's the crisis that we have seen last year was resolved to a significant degree by gas demand reduction. A significant share of that came through industrial gas demand reduction. And if you look into industrial gas demand reduction, the first thing that you find is that GDP in Europe increased and that industrial production in Europe actually also increased. So what has happened is that total manufacturing continued to go up, but a few sectors, a few very energy intensive sectors reduced their gas consumption drastically. So you see them here: paper, chemicals, non-metallic minerals, basic minerals. And then if you dive deeper into that, you can identify a few hundred products, classic urea, methanol, ammonia, some basic steel that are making up a lot of the energy consumption, have relatively little value added, and generate typically not that many jobs. And the question is, if we now go ahead with a tight supply situation in Europe, yeah, next slide is fine. Thank you. With a tight supply situation, we will continue to see high prices in Europe. So the lower right bar graph shows you the expected prices and the price divergence between Europe and the United States. And what we can observe is that European gas prices will stay 2 or 3 times the level of the Henry Hub gas prices if nothing happens. And correspondingly, electricity prices will stay significantly higher. Now, policy in Germany and other member states seem to be, okay, we subsidize energy-intensive industry in order to then outlive the crisis, and then cheap energy will return. But I do not necessarily see that we are getting gas and energy made available to European industrial consumers at the same cost as in other parts of the world. And here the question is, what are we going to do? So we can build a lot of LNG terminals, and we are doing that. But LNG at the importing side will always be much more expensive than at the exporting side, which is logical. So what we argue is that the challenge ahead for Europe is to replace about 1,500 terawatt hours of Russian gas. And there's 3 things you can do. So you can essentially draw a triangle. One thing is you can do is you try to import a lot of natural gas and at some point hydrogen and subsidize it so that you maintain your consumption. So society is going to pay for it. The second option is you can start to build domestic energy generation, so nuclear, renewables massively, and potentially transform your industry to be able to consume electricity rather than gas. And the third option is you outsource some of your energy-intensive production to other parts of the world that are more energy competitive, and then import those things like ammonia, and then you produce your energy-intensive, your chemical high-value products based on imported pre-products. And my take would be that the policy choice now is not kind of which of the edges of the triangle we choose, but where in the triangle we will situate. And my worry is that the political economy is very much towards the first option, subsidization of existing incumbent consumers of energy. But as an economist, you would think back of comparative advantages that different parts of the world have, and you don't see Europe having a comparative advantage in low energy prices anytime soon. So I would highlight, and I hope that's sufficiently provocative for a discussion, that Europe should think more about not so much importing necessarily very kind of commoditized energy, but rather importing commoditized energy-intensive products, which help other parts of the world to move up the value chain a bit, but which help Europe to stay competitive in the high-value products that generate the high value added, and hence allow the high wages that Europeans want to see. I think with maybe if that has not been provocative enough, then the last slide. And here the take is that even within Europe, the geography might have to change. What we see is that a lot of our energy-intensive industry is situated in places where there have been coal mines in the 19th century. And since then, we have always supported them to stay there by building them nuclear plants and building them gas plants and with pipelines to Russia. And the point is now that energy will be cheap at the coasts. The energy will be cheap in the south, but not necessarily in those industrial heartlands. And the question is, will we bring them the energy via expensive transmission lines, and or will some of the energy-intensive industry not necessarily move abroad, but also move within Europe? So questions like German splitting of price zones, having energy intensive production in Spain and importing the iron the primary steel from Spain rather than producing it domestically in Germany. So with those thoughts, I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zachmann, and I'm sure that was quite some food for thought and also for discussion. Bringing energy to the people or bringing value creation and employment to places where energy is cheap. This is, of course, one of the key future questions on a very strategic basis. But maybe before we go into these industrial policy questions, I would ask or like to ask into our audience to what extent there are questions when it comes to the analysis of the next winter's outlook, electricity-wise, gas-wise. How safe are we going to be next winter? Is the availability of gas and electricity given, or are there some risky factors? We've heard of some. And I look into our list of attendees, whether there are already rising hands. Otherwise, I would have one which has not been touched so far, I guess, and that was on the gas flows within Europe and within Germany, as we're also talking in these days about additional LNG ports, not only in the North Sea, but also in the Baltic Sea. And one of the risks that hasn't been mentioned is to what extent does the gas flow into the other direction from west to east? Is that a given? Are there issues that have additionally be addressed? To what extent does the gas market also physically will function, or do you see scarcity bottlenecks that we have to address before? I don't know who of you would like to answer. Is that another risk that we might have to think of? Who wants to go first? Yeah, Mr. Böhmer.
Yeah, happy to go first. So I would think that in light of the strong efforts by Germany, for instance, but also other companies to heavily invest in LNG regasification terminals, I would not think. I will think that these problems of the bottlenecks that we saw last winter, that were the cause for these price spreads. I would think that we see less of that in the upcoming winter, and that would take some of that strain out. But as Mr. Zachmann mentioned, last winter there was also problems of an outage of one of the gas supply routes. So those are, of course, problems that cannot really foresee. And if we see something like that again, then we might see such blockages in the flows again.
Okay, so that was more on the general ports, but on the Baltic, North Sea, inner German distribution of gas that the Bundesnetzagentur in these days mentioned in order to ask for additional ports in Rügen or in the Baltic Sea, you wouldn't see really an issue there.
I mean, I find it's a very complex discussion, because on the one hand, there's this discussion of, do we create stranded assets with LNG terminals, and do we need all of them? Now, Germany has had a very bad experience with trying to have exactly as much import capacity as its demand, because that meant it had no optionality in the situation of a crisis. And I think the question here is, how do we generate what energy economists typically call N-1, that if the largest supply route fails, we still have enough availability of energy resources for us, which we didn't ensure until 2022. And the cost of those LNG terminals seem to, I mean, in the larger picture of things, they are not kind of outrageously high if compared to the effects of the crisis that we had last year. So it is I think it's a challenging balancing act, and the methodological discussions in the German political sphere are still very much based on, okay, this is the amount of gas we are going to need in 2025 or in 2030, and this is the amount of gas that we can get. But I think that's not that's only half of the picture. So we should think about security of supply more, given the crisis that we had. At the same time, I also understand the point that locking in long-term gas contracts until 2050 is maybe not the right thing to do if the clearly stated policy goal is to be carbon neutral by the 2040s. So it is an very, very challenging area. My personal take would be that having a terminal in the Baltic Sea is also a political signal towards Eastern Europe that we care for them. I mean, the Ukrainians were actually quite eager to push for a terminal in the Baltic Sea. So I'm a bit surprised that this thing is so controversial, while the terminals in West Germany are not.
Okay. So one of the lessons learned, resilience will and should play maybe another role than in the past. That could be one of the outcomes of the last year's crisis. Then you have named several critical factors. One of them being the change of behavior. On the one hand side, when it comes to industrial consumption, we've seen that industry has reduced its consumption last winter, mainly due to production losses, partly by fuel switch, but also private households have reduced their consumption. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. Is that a given for next winter with the current prices, or people just get fed up with all these savings and all policymakers asking them to change behavior? Is that demand coming back after 1 year, and might that change the picture significantly? To what extent is that something that we can predict or maybe also influence?
I would say, predict. Then you have to look at how we expect prices to develop over the year. Now, of course, this relates more to industry, which might see these prices more direct compared to households, where we know, at least in Germany, there's a very indirect price signal going to consumers, right? So I think when we look at consumers, it will be important to see that if prices go up again, will we see similar measures as we have seen last year? Will there again be government policies lowering or capping consumer prices to sort of shield consumers from high energy prices?
Mm-hmm. I mean, my take would be that on the one side, we will have kind of some structural measures that kick in. I mean, people will install more heat pumps, and we are seeing that isolation of windows and doors are things that kind of, if they are once in place, they will stay in place. On the question of whether we had a big campaign that led to savings, I mean, it's a bit early to tell, but my observation was that there was not much. I mean, I don't know whether you have seen anything that you felt was powerful in Germany in terms of campaigning for lower consumption. So prices and the fear of high prices would be my gut feeling, where maybe the strongest contributor. And now we have to see whether people think, okay, prices are still significantly higher than before the crisis, therefore we continue our sober behavior, or whether they say, okay, now we have predictability and actually it's worthwhile the €5 more to have it warm in a week. So that is very hard to predict. And maybe one sentence on that. I mean, there's a bit of a missed opportunity in my view. We have so much data now available on gas saving behavior in the different DSOs and for different consumer groups. I mean, we should make that available to researchers and to be able to understand what the elasticities here are, because that's going to be crucial for the energy transition, to get a feeling of how prices and consumption interact. And with this massive crisis, I think we have a first-class experiment and companies earned a lot of money with that experiment. So let's at least share the data and make it possible for policymakers to base their decisions on better data. If you recall the discussions that we had in the gas commission, I mean, their main complaint was they are going to decide on something without having any idea on the elasticities, and which is they didn't have little data to base their decisions on.
That was an expensive experiment, in fact. I'm looking for questions from the audience, but I don't see any risen hands so far. So let's take up, I think, Mr. Zachmann's provocative thesis on what could be and should be the right reactions to be prepared for next winter or the next years. I think one of your conclusions was prices won't come back to the levels that we have seen, neither for gas nor for electricity, as I well understood. Question was, to what extent should we help industry to stay, energy intensive industry to stay, that has reduced its production significantly in the last month? To what extent should we foster any fuel switch to electricity and hydrogen in the next years, or let them go to some extent to other regions, and hoping that the industrial cluster will not move as a total, but just the very energy intensive processes, and they won't affect the rest of the value chain. So this is, I think, one of the big strategic questions policymakers have to give an answer to. And I'm sure there will be views, both of you, but also from the floor and from the audience. Mr. Böhmer, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think we need to maybe differentiate between, as you already did, between the power markets and gas markets and the prices that we see there, because I think it is very much the expectations of policymakers that at least power prices will go down in the medium term, in line with the fast buildup of renewables, where then the expectation is, the more low-cost renewables we have in the system, the lower power prices will be. And I think this is also shown by the debate around the industry electricity price that was recently tabled, a proposal which should extend until 2030, because the expectations is, this is a transition phase, and until then, gas will be maybe more or less driven out of the power market, and then we see lower prices. But I think it is clear to say that at least gas prices, we can be very clear on saying that these will not come down to sort of the Russian pipeline flow price levels. I think it all comes down to whether we can have this transition and the sector coupling, and what you mentioned before, that industry can also do that fuel switch from gas to power in many production processes as well, and whether you could bridge that sort of 10 years, whether it makes sense to bridge these 10 years with government support, in the hope of then having lower power prices, or just let them go. But yeah, I would say that at least for those industries that are heavily reliant on gas, or maybe in the future hydrogen, there will be just this drastic price disadvantage compared to other regions.
So bridging the valley of death for electricity, but letting those who still depend on gas or maybe on green hydrogen face the force of the markets. Mr. Zachmann, is that the differentiated answer you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the idea that we need a differentiated answer, and that I mean, it would politically anyway not fly to say we just let markets decide how the industrial structure of Germany or the European Union is going to look like. So to a certain degree, industrial strategy will happen, and we should inform it in a complex way. On electricity, my take would be that at least some relocation inside Germany and also inside the European Union towards the places where we get cheap access to electricity would relieve the stress on network build-outs quite drastically, and could reduce the overall system cost, energy system cost quite a bit. So I think it's something we need to study more clearly. Another challenge in Europe is that if we assume now we have a limited cake of energy available in Europe, and Germany subsidizes its energy-intensive industry, both gas and electricity intensive, to be able to sustain the storm, energy prices in the rest of Europe will be higher because the Germans are buying up this energy, which means that then it will kind of speed up the process of killing the Italian steel industry and the French gas-intensive industry, which is certainly not going to make Germany a lot of friends in Europe. And we, I mean, on that sense, we kind of having at the same time a joint internal market for energy, subsidizing and allowing the others not to subsidize through fiscal rules is a very, very brutal way of a German policy here. And I guess a more kind of a softer and more European approach that is maybe more strategic will be needed. But I understand, of course, that the interests at stake are huge. But the problem doesn't go away from that. I mean, the problem is we are lacking 1,500 terawatt hour of Russian gas. We are lacking quite a substantial amount of electricity still. And just by subsidizing to give this energy to somebody, we are taking not only money to them, but we are also taking energy away from them. And that in the overall system need to be replaced from somewhere. The only structural solution is increasing supply or letting demand go. If we don't want to let demand go, we have to increase supply, and we better do it quickly.
And increasing supply will take at least another 2 or 3 years. LNG supply will increase, as we hear from investments in other countries, but of course it will take time. Another option would also, of course, to increase indigenous gas production, European production. This is well then a question of public acceptance when it comes to new production technologies. When it comes to the gas markets, I think what you've rightly mentioned is that, well, gas markets are highly linked. We've bought LNG away from other regions like in Asia, in Pakistan, India, who couldn't afford to pay the same amount of money for LNG. So in fact, as long as gas is scarce, probably richer countries are better positioned to bridge the gap until supply will follow demand. Last time to raise a question before our session is completed. And do look again, but you seem to be quite satisfied with all the answers that have been given. No, there is one, Daniel Böhmer.
Yeah, just one thing raised my interest, and that was the point on the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you made, Mr. Zachmann, because you said that this is not a driver for onshoring of industry. Is that just because it's out of the equation, because we're talking energy prices here and then there we're talking carbon prices, or do you see the measure as ineffective in itself? So that was just something I was wondering when you presented your slides.
Yeah, I didn't talk about carbon border adjustment. Maybe there was a leftover in the slides. I mean, what I meant to say on the carbon border adjustment is that it was a policy decided in the old times before the war. It was decided in a time when we are still hoping to get Russian gas and kind of have a more orderly transition path. And now we have a situation where importing a lot of the products that fall under carbon border adjustment are actually those products we might want to outsource to a certain degree. So, I mean, if we talk about ammonia or methanol and primary steel, that's exactly the goods that are under carbon border adjustment. And I mean, I rather prefer to import ammonia into Germany and export then high-value chemicals elsewhere than to not import ammonia anymore and not export anything because the whole chemical industry becomes too expensive. And therefore, I have never been a big fan of carbon border adjustment, but I think the most recent developments must also kind of be again reflected in the policy making on that.
Well, thank you so much. It's already 12 o'clock, so we've spent the time very well, I think. Thank you to both of you, to the presentations, to all the questions that you've answered and risen at the same time. So that was really a fruitful discussion that we saw. When it comes to the electricity prices for industrial sector, I'm sure we will see a heated discussion in the next weeks to come, not only in Germany, but there are, of course, also other countries in Europe, like France, that will have to look for their way forward, as I think also in France, for instance, their industrial electricity tariff has to be renewed next year, and they have to find new solutions. So Europe, as such, will have to find an answer how it might bridge times of higher prices to stay competitive in global terms as well. For all those who want to read what we've heard more in depth, there is the chapter, I think, that will be published with our Energie für Deutschland publication in a few weeks' time. But it's also in this chat. Is that right, Mrs. Kusch?
Yes, we will publish the article within the run of the week on our website. And of course, we'll inform you on social media, for example. So watch out for the article. Perfect. Will be published soon.
Together with the presentations, I guess.
Yes.
So,
and the video.
Everything available. Thank you very much for your attention.